little town of Bethlehem, how still we see the light.
Hello everyone, my name is Isis and this is IsisSaysHi. I like to make a lot of research videos about topics that matter to me and sometimes I vlog. Let's get into me talking about myself, because narcissism. I have been trying to film this video. I think I've had it done. Oh yeah, last edit was November 30th, but I got my wisdom teeth taken out and then I got bogged down with a lot of work. And then I was like, oh, I can film it this week. And then I was like, wait a minute, Isis, you can just film it when you get your hair done. So my hair, as you can see, has been done and I'm gonna film. Trigger warning, talking about surgery. I was conscious, which they suggest you be conscious during like tooth extractions. I was under like anesthesia that would like numb all of it. And it's so weird because I had fallen asleep just in general. I don't even know when I fell asleep, but then I woke up. I like felt them working on my teeth and I was like, wow, y'all are really hacking in. But like I didn't feel the pain, if that makes sense. Like I was very much conscious, very much awake, but also not really. So it was really funny. It was very weird, very odd. 0 out of 10 would not recommend. I've been getting into drinking the caramel brulee latte. It's so good. Also, sometimes during meetings, I have this like cuticle cutter situation. So sometimes I will cut my cuticles during meetings or my nails, something I do when I'm anxious or fidgety. I'm promoting nail health, right? Today we're going to be talking about Stockholm Syndrome. What is Stockholm Syndrome? Describes the psychological condition of a victim who identifies with and empathizes with their captor or their abuser. Stockholm Syndrome is pretty rare. The guinea pigs act like full-on human beings. Freaks me out because I'm like, who the heck is in this house making all that noise? It's the guinea pigs. Let's start over. Stockholm Syndrome describes the psychological condition of a victim who identifies with their captor or abuser, or they empathize with their captor or abuser. Stockholm Syndrome is incredibly rare, and according to one FBI study, the condition occurs in about 8% of hostage victims. By the 21st century, psychologists had expanded their understanding of Stockholm Syndrome. They've expanded it from just it being about hostages to also explaining victims of domestic violence, cult members, prisoners of war, procured prostitutes, and abused children. The American Psychiatric Association, or APA, does not include Stockholm Syndrome in its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is a DSM. Did you know there was an international DSM? Didn't know that. Don't know why America had to make their own. So it is not in the DSM, which is pretty much like the handbook for all the mental disorders. The history of Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome was first coined by psychiatrist Nils Bejerot following a bank heist in Sweden, but Bejerot never spoke to the woman that he based it on and never bothered to ask her why she trusted her captors more than she trusted the authorities. Allegedly! It seems like Bejerot and the authorities made up the term as a way to make themselves look better, especially after Kristen Enmark, who is the person that he based Stockholm Syndrome on, criticized Bejerot for endangering the hostages' lives by behaving aggressively and agitating the captors, and the police were pointing guns at the convicts while the hostages were still in the line of fire. She was also critical of Prime Minister Olof Palme, so Kristen Enmark was on the phone with Prime Minister Olof, but the Prime Minister had told her that she would have to content herself to die at her post rather than give in to the captor's demands. She also told news outlets that one of the captors tried to protect the hostages from being caught in the crossfire. She also criticized the police after the heist was over for their macho grandstanding when they paraded the captors up and down the street. I have a lot of words and I'm not going to say them. When told of Enmark's criticism of the authorities, Bejerot simply dismissed her comments and said it was a product of Stockholm Syndrome. Didn't really actually make sure that it could be attributed to her because he never spoke to her, like ever. Kristen Enmark, I have some quotes from her. One says, "Yes, I was afraid of the police. What is so strange about that is afraid of those who are all around in parks, on roofs, behind corners in armored vests, helmets, and weapons ready to shoot." Kristen Enmark was the first person to be diagnosed with Stockholm Syndrome, and ever since her diagnosis, she's carried that stigma with her, especially since he said it so publicly. She said, "I always felt that I did something wrong. You're not healthy when you have a syndrome," and for more than 40 years, she's felt silenced by the weight of the diagnosis. So if you say these girls or me have this syndrome, you don't have to pay attention to what they say. And if you want to hear more about her story, about what happened, you can listen to The Ideal Hostage, which I will link down below. Stockholm Syndrome isn't always used in a way that is to explain complex psychological issues, even if it might not be exactly what you want to hear, or it may not help with your criminal case. It is rude to just ignore them and what they're saying and how they're feeling. The Stockholm Robbery. On August 23rd, 1973, 3 people were taken hostage at Kreditbanken, one of the largest banks in Stockholm, Sweden, by Jan-Erik Olsson, a convict who was on parole. He was later joined by another after he negotiated the release of his friend, Clark Olofsson, to assist him, which we'll get into that. A bank employee did trigger a silent alarm, and policeman did respond, but Jan had shot him in the hand, and the hostage situation began to take shape. Jan-Erik Olsson was a safecracker who was on leave from prison, serving a 3-year sentence for theft. He was furloughed, so as a furloughed prisoner, he was allowed to go out and live among the community and mingle, so that way when he is eventually released, he'll be able to adjust to life outside and not, get himself in trouble to go back into prison again. And that is a great idea. I know people don't trust people who go to jail. If you're going to keep them in jail for a very long time and then just kick them out when their sentence is done, the least you could do is make sure that they actually have resources and the ability to live life on the outside. Otherwise, what's the point of just letting them leave prison without any real resources or safety or ability to get themselves back up on their feet or adjust to life outside? I think there's people who went to jail when the iPhones first came out, and so when they come out and they see the iPhones now, it freaks them out. So it's I think that's the least you could do. Anyways, I'm getting on a rant. Moving forward. So when Jan was supposed to return back to prison, he had actually waived it, so he just ignored him actually having to return, it was mandatory for him, and he donned a wig and sunglasses and headed to the bank. To give background to Jan-Erik, he was arrested for robbery. The story of the robbery goes is that years earlier, he had actually helped a man he was robbing after he collapsed from a heart attack. So the guy, obviously, I'm assuming, realizing his house was getting robbed, freaked out and had a heart attack, and so Jan-Erik helped, gave first aid to the man who was having the heart attack and still continued to rob his house. That's the funniest thing that I've ever heard, but also he really wasn't that bad. Back to the robbery. Jan-Erik took 3 bank employees at first and let everybody else leave. There was another one, and we're going to get into how they found the other one. His demands were 3 million Swedish krona and around 700,000 USD and other kinds of currencies, a bulletproof vest, and a fast car. He also wanted Clark Olofsson, an old friend and former cellmate, to be brought to the bank. Clark Olofsson was in prison for armed robbery in which a policeman had been killed, and so he had kind of become a celebrity in the criminal underworld for theft and escaping prison. Jan-Erik and Clark had met at the Kalmar Correctional Facility, and Jan had asked Clark how to rob banks and maneuver hostages, and Clark answered all the questions, not realizing that one day his knowledge would be used. That's so stupid. Of course it would be used. And then this is what Clark said. His plan was to get me to the bank so he can relax. I will fix it. Clark was actually in solitary confinement, which is probably not the way that we view it in America. Probably wasn't as terrifying, still bad, but not as terrible as in America. When the call came, and so he was happy to help. Clark said, "The Minister of Justice called me in the prison. He said, there is one man in Stockholm who demands you to be transported to him. What do you say?" I said, "Yes, of course. I'll come immediately." While the police worked on getting Jan's comrade to the bank, rumors had spread of the crisis unfolding in the capital. Of course, the media arrived, and I believe it was the first crime to be broadcast live on television. What a time. Public immediately began to call the police with suggestions on how to help them get the hostages out. One was including making the floor slippery so that the thief was easy to capture. How are the police going to be capturing them if the floor is slippery? Filling the bank with bees, and playing religious songs into the building, because everybody wants to hear our God is an awesome God while they're trying to rob a bank. Upon Clark's arrival by police escort, the hostages were taken into a small bank vault to ensure they couldn't escape. Clark then actually checked the bank to confirm that no police had snuck inside, but instead he actually found another bank employee who was hiding, and his name is Sven Safstrom. So now we have 4 hostages. So there were 3, and the 3 were women. And then they found Sven, and so they had 3 women, 1 man. Clark quickly began to take control of the situation and told Jan to loosen the binds on the women. The 2 robbers began to form a bond with the captives. The robbers provided tampons for their female prisoners and sliced up pears provided by the negotiators outside to ensure there was enough food to go around. The hostages asked to make phone calls to their loved ones, and when Brigitta Lundblad couldn't get a hold of her family, Jan told her to keep trying. Another hostage, Elizabeth Oldgren, suffered from claustrophobia, and inside the small space, she began to suffer a panic attack. Jan took her outside and attached a long rope to her so she could walk around and calm herself. She had later said that was the nicest thing anyone's ever done. The hostage situation, I keep accidentally going out of focus and my camera keeps getting confused. Either that or they don't realize that a black person is filming. The hostage situation lasted 6 days, and by the 2nd day, the captives were on first name terms with Clark and Jan. Kristen Enmark was even given a bullet from one of the guns as a keepsake. She would later describe Clark as a mix between, as a mix between Che Guevara and Jesus. When she spoke to the Swedish Prime Minister during her captivity, she asked to leave with the robbers in the car, saying, "I fully trust Clark and the robber. I am not desperate. They haven't done a thing to us. On the contrary, they have been very nice. But you know, Olaf, what I am scared of is that the police will attack and cause us to die." They spoke to the Prime Minister for nearly an hour. The hostages had begun to just trust the police more than the bank robbers, and when the police commissioner was allowed inside the bank to ensure the hostages were safe, he was met with resentment from the 4 bank employees instead of relief. Despite being threatened with harm, the hostages still sided with their captors, with Sven Safstrom applauding Jan for only wanting to shoot him in the leg, and luckily nobody had to be shot or anything. Throughout the 6 days that they were hostages, they spoke to a lot of media outlets on the phone to tell them that they were safe and that the police needed to stay away. Clark also called multiple news stations to ensure that their side of the story was being told correctly. On the 3rd day, a policeman assessed the bank and shut the vault door with the 6 people inside it. The police had stopped all negotiations with the robbers, no more food, no more water, and they had begun to drill holes in the vault. The drilling was constant and loud, and the water used to cool down the drills filled the vault, which they were trapped in the wet darkness for 3 more days. On the 6th day, tear gas was administered into the vault via the holes drilled by the police, and Clark and Jan surrendered. Why did you need to wait 3 days? The only thing I can think of is maybe they thought that Clark and Jan would have given up by then, but I don't know. Anyways, when police told hostages to leave the building, they refused, saying their captors would be shot if they went out separately. So instead, they all hugged each other in the doorway of the vault, shook hands and kissed, and they all walked out together, with Jan and Clark leading the way. I feel like they still would have been shot, but whatever. As she was put onto the stretcher and taken to the hospital, Kristen Enmark shouted, "Clark, I will see you again." Jan Erik Olsen was charged with violent robbery, kidnapping, and attempted murder, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And he was released in the 1980s, and he moved to Thailand, where he married the woman he'd become pen pals with when he was in prison. And after 15 years, he returned to Sweden with his family and ran a car repair shop. Love that. He never went back to prison and publicly apologized for the hostage situation. Clark Olofsson was returned to prison after he was taken from the bank and was charged with violent robbery. He defended himself in court and argued that he was forced into taking part in the bank robbery and hostage situation by the police. Clark spent many years in and out of incarceration for other crimes, including drug smuggling and theft. In 1976, he married this name and had a family with her. He's appeared on the podcast Criminal, and in May 2020, Netflix cast Bill Skarsgård to play him in the movie Clark, which I haven't watched, and I didn't actually know was a movie until I did research. The hostages made regular visits to their 2 captors in prison and still spoke highly of the 2 men. Kristen Enmark even lied in court and said that she never saw Clark hold a gun during the 6 days. She didn't believe that he should have been punished for his forced involvement, which I agree. But I mean, if Clark is saying that he technically wasn't really forced, he agreed to it. She didn't believe that he should have been punished for his forced involvement. Her and the other hostages even tried raising money for their defense. The 4 hostages had developed an affection for Olsen, saying he treated them well, according to a BBC article in 2013. Elizabeth Oldgren, who was another one of the hostages, said she thought that it was kind of Olsen to allow her to leave the vault they were originally being held so she could move around the floor of the bank, even though there was a rope fixed around her neck when she was doing it. Sven Safstrom said he felt grateful when Olsen told him he would shoot him, but pointed out he wouldn't kill him and would let him get drunk first so he wouldn't feel the pain as much. I don't know why back in those days they thought like getting somebody drunk or just giving them a ton of alcohol would like ease the pain. I cannot tell you whenever I've been tipsy, like the pain also just like wasn't there. Like I'm pretty sure I could have still felt pain if somebody like hit me in the face. I don't know. Olsen felt the same connection with the hostages. Olsen spoke harshly. It was the hostages' fault. They did everything I told them to do. If they hadn't, I might not be here now. Why didn't any of them attack me? They made it hard to kill. They made us go on living together day after day like goats in that filth. There was nothing to do but get to know each other. The hostages spent 10 days in the hospital being evaluated by doctors and specialists, trying to determine why they act the way that they had. And this behavior hadn't been seen in citizens before, and a few months later was labeled Stockholm Syndrome. It was originally defined by psychiatrist Oakberg to aid the management of hostage situations. It was kind of named this before, if I'm not mistaken. Denotation, I think it's called, is the textbook definition of something, and connotation is what it socially or culturally is known as. So the connotation for Stockholm Syndrome comes from the robbery. I think it's called denotation, I can't remember. The denotation definition is actually by Frank Oakberg, but a lot of people know Stockholm Syndrome the way that I just described it. I just talked about it with the story, if that makes sense. I hope that made sense. Other criticisms of Stockholm Syndrome. So the first one comes from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the DSM. Usually has all of the disorders, mental disorders, psychological disorders that can occur or can exist. DSM-5, I believe, I don't think they made a 6 yet. I think DSM-5 is like the latest, the most recent. If I am wrong, I apologize. But that came out in 2013. And the DSM-5 was widely used as the classification system for psychological disorders by the American Psychiatric Association, and Stockholm Syndrome has not historically appeared in the manual, as many believe it falls under trauma bonding or post-traumatic stress disorder. Trauma bonding, as far as what I remember it being as, is you kind of bond with somebody because you both have kind of gone through the same situations or the same thing, and it was highly traumatic. I've had friendships in the past where trauma bonding was definitely the reason why we were friends, and if there's nothing outside of that trauma keeping the friendship, that's mostly how you know it's probably a trauma bond, and generally it's not good to have those. If there's nothing else uniting you both together outside of that trauma, you're kind of just allowing yourself to be re-traumatized outside of just like trying to heal from it. Post-traumatic stress disorder, I feel like most of us understand what that is. Just having a lot of psychological effects from a really big trauma situation. So you might have like certain things that you need to do, like locking the door 4 times, which I mean that's a little bit more OCD than anything, but like a lot of vets when they come back, especially from like when it was the Vietnam War or the Iraq War, just had a lot of habits and ways that they tried to cope with the trauma that they had. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is kind of that, maybe resorting to drinking to kind of help with those feelings. In relation to Stockholm Syndrome, there's no consensus about where exactly it would fit underneath either of those. There also isn't a huge body of research on Stockholm Syndrome to be able to make a consensus or to able to come to a decision about if it should be included in the DSM, and if it's not its own like page or term in the DSM, where does it fall under? Stockholm Syndrome is just very rare, a very, very rare thing to encounter. It's just like really, really hard to actually study it. A research group led by ManiqueHere has found that although there is a lot of media coverage of Stockholm Syndrome, there has not been a lot of research into the phenomenon. What little research has been done is often contradictory and does not always agree on what Stockholm Syndrome exactly is. The term has grown beyond kidnappings to all definitions of abuse, which is problematic, and there is no clear definition of symptoms to diagnose the syndrome. A 1998 report by the FBI containing over 1,200 hostage incidents found that only 8% of kidnapping victims showed signs of Stockholm Syndrome, and when victims who showed negative and positive feelings toward the law enforcement personnel are excluded, that actually decreases to 5. A survey of 600 police agencies in 1989, performed by the FBI and the University of Vermont, found not a single case when emotional involvement between the victim and kidnapper interfered with or jeopardized an assault. In short, that was a lot of words. This database provides a lot of support that Stockholm Syndrome is still very rare. The sensational nature of the dramatic cases causes the public to perceive Stockholm Syndrome as the rule rather than exception. So it is not very frequent, and yeah. If there is emotional involvement between a victim and the kidnapper, it's very rare. Another one, I have two more. Robbins and Anthony, who historically studied a condition similar to Stockholm Syndrome, known as destructive cult disorder, observed in their 1982 study that the 1970s were rich with apprehension surrounding the potential risks of brainwashing, and they assert that media attention to brainwashing during this time resulted in the reception of Stockholm Syndrome as a psychological condition. So it's definitely more of a cultural thing than it is actually a psychological thing. My voice is a little sore because sometimes I like to sing To Be Loved in my car, or just in general, so my voice is always a bit sore after I sing it. Lastly, where I got a good chunk of the context for Kristen Edmark from, in her 2019 treatise on domestic violence, See What You Made Me Do, Australian journalist Jess Hill described the syndrome as a dubious pathology with no diagnostic criteria, which is true, and stated that it is riddled with misogyny and founded on a lie. She also noted that a 2008 literature review revealed that most diagnoses of Stockholm Syndrome are made by the media, not by psychologists or psychiatrists. In particular, Hill's analysis revealed that Stockholm authorities, under direct guidance from Bergerot, responded to the robbery in a way that put the hostages at greater risk from the police than from the captors, which would explain why the hostages didn't trust the police and trusted their captors more. As well, she observed that not only was Bergerot's diagnosis of Edmark made without ever having spoken to her, it was in direct response to her public criticism of his actions during the hostage situation. Pretty much just said it in an interview to explain away what she was saying and her feelings. So yeah, final thoughts. It's time for me. I would say Stockholm Syndrome is kind of like a lie in a way. I don't know. I didn't realize how, I knew I just kind of hated the term. It just always felt off to me, but I didn't realize like why I hated the term until I started to look it up. It's like really sexist in nature, and for a lot of the situations that it's used in, my literal ear just went, my ear just lost hearing in one side. I realized like, because of like the way that the connotation of Stockholm Syndrome really does kind of like do a disservice to act like victims and people who are trying to, explain their story, explain why they feel the way that they feel, and the way that Stockholm Syndrome usually is done and said, like it is with a lot of mental disorders. It's less about explaining someone and making sure to view them and their story with that lens, and it's more to shame and kind of make their story not seem as important as it is. It's never good to diagnose somebody you haven't talked to just to give somebody a psychological disorder and not put a disclaimer like I assume or I think. And I don't think it's wrong to empathize with people, and I can understand that as a victim, especially if you're going through a traumatic situation, you're most likely going to empathize with your captor. And in this situation, like, it really made sense to empathize with their captors because it wasn't like the police were treating them any better. And like I've been kind of saying with a lot of the series when I talk about the start of a lot of the psychological stuff, that psychological terms that I hear about and am trying to kind of break down a little bit more to see like, is it actually something that should be like we should think about and we should take for face value? And from the ones that I've talked about, a lot of it is no. A lot of it is people just mixing in their ideas about folks. A lot of it is not really steeped in actual research, and a lot of it tries to explain away or ignore the fact that these are like real life humans in real life situations. So the way that they might view and do things doesn't always need a diagnosis. Empathizing with people is part of what makes us human, and doing so as a captive isn't the result of some syndrome. Wouldn't you want to suck up to your captor if your life was literally on the line? And reducing the intricacies of human empathy while simultaneously hand-waving away women's feelings to something beyond their control is a worrying oversimplification of a complex issue. So those are like the written words that sound way better than what I just said, but it's fine. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to subscribe. I think I have like 13 more people until it's 100, so that's kind of dope. Rise that up if you want me to hit 100. I don't know what I would do, but thank you for get me to that goal by like 16 days. I can't believe they didn't give me a holiday cup. Anyways, moving on. Thank you for watching. Oh, so sorry, excuse me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you most likely next year. Hopefully I'll put this out by the end of the month. All right, bye.